Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the third in the NASIO NGA series of comprehensive energy planning webinars and training series. We're glad to have you with us here on this balmy Friday afternoon. At least it is here in DC. I'm sure it is pretty warm in all your other cities as well. But we're glad to have you here for another hour of really talking through various aspects of comprehensive energy planning and some of the best practices that go into them. We do have three great speakers for you here today, and we'll get to that in just a second. But I want to provide first, a quick thank you to our sponsors, both the Office of State and Community Energy Programs, as well as the Office of Electricity with the U.S. Department of Energy. So thank you very much for your support and for your funding of this effort. So the topic of what we want to discuss today in the aspect of energy planning is data collection and modeling. These days, energy offices and governor's offices are increasingly using data and modeling to support potential energy pathways they may identify in their comprehensive energy plans. They found that comprehensive data collection and modeling gives additional credence and weight to recommendations outlined in the plan. They provide visual and numerical backing for policy and programmatic decisions. Data collection is also critical because it helps the state take better stock of its existing energy portfolios rather than in pieces or only for specific sectors. So with better baseline data, states can better position themselves to make the needed changes to address the issues that the data is revealing. So we've got three great speakers here today to talk us through some of their best practices for how they developed their plans and leverage data and modeling in the construction of those plans. Before we get started, we will take questions once every speaker has presented, and we'll have a nice discussion as well. If you do have questions for any of our speakers, please make sure to put them in the chat box or the Q&A box, and those will be located at either the bottom or the top of your screens. So our three panelists today, our first panelist is Sushma Mays-Moore. She is the Assistant Secretary for the Environment with the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. And then we'll have Claire McElveny. She is the Data and Equity Policy Manager with the Regulated Utility Planning Division with the Vermont Department of Public Service. And then finally, we'll also have Ryan Welsh. He is an Energy Technology Analyst and Systems Modeler with the Virginia Department of Energy. So first, we'll turn things over to Sushma, who can get started with talking to us about the North Carolina experience for energy planning. Sushma?
Thanks, Sam. So hello, everybody. I'm going to go back a couple years when I was the state energy director, and we worked on our state energy plan. And so this presentation is a couple years old, but it's still very valid and active in what we're doing in the state.
Looks like we may have lost Sushma for a second here. So what we'll do is we'll do a quick pivot. Claire, do you mind stepping up and giving us a Vermont perspective?
Sure, happy to. All right, so I similarly am stepping back a few years. I modified these slides from when we were developing our comprehensive energy plan back in 2021 in Vermont. And so planning to just give like a high level framing of what obligates us and what we're looking at in comprehensive energy planning in Vermont, and then some high level touch points on the modeling we did, and hopefully we'll get into some more of the details during the discussion. But in Vermont, our approach to energy planning is really rooted in energy policy. I have kind of Vermont's energy policy here in Title 30, and what that obligates us as the Department of Public Service to help carry out. I won't read through this, but that really flows into the two energy plans that we're required to do every 6 years based on that statute. So we do, one is a comprehensive energy plan. That's a 20-year look at analysis and projections of energy use, supply, cost, environmental impact of all energy sources. So it covers all sectors. And then we separately have an obligation to do a similar 20-year assessment specific to the electric sector. So these two plans are on the same timeline. We're required to do both of them at least every 6 years. We could choose to do them more frequently if we wanted to. And we typically say that, the electric chapter of the comprehensive energy plan and some supplement counts as the electric plan. We could separate them more explicitly if we wanted to. And I will say before moving on, this is a plan that's coordinated by the Department of Public Service in consultation with all the other state agencies that are impacted and contribute to energy work in the state, but it must be consistent with greenhouse gas requirements and the Climate Action Plan in Vermont, which is pursuant to our Global Warming Solutions Act, which was passed in 2020, which is a plan written by the Vermont Climate Council, which has participation from the agencies, but is guided by a broader body of stakeholders. And when we were doing the leading up to the 2022 Comprehensive Energy Plan, we were actually developing it in tandem with that Climate Action Plan. So the modeling that we ended up using was used for both plans to guide their development. The plans are not identical, they just have to be consistent. But this was, there was an intentional choice made early on to do them with the same sort of source modeling to support that consistency. So we partnered with the Agency of Natural Resources, who helped guide the development of the Climate Action Plan and with the Climate Council, in addition to I'm gonna read the name of the acronym. So NESCOM, Northeast States for Coordinated Air Use Management, and the Stockholm Environment Institute to use the LEAP modeling tool as our main kind of modeling source, which is the low emissions analysis platform, in part because it provides a very bottom-up look at both energy and non-energy sectors. So it allowed us to take kind of the comprehensive look that we needed to in order to support both of those plans and coordinate across the agencies. So just so folks, I'm really visual. I have two different snapshots of, on the left, kind of what that model looks like at a high level. It's different components. It starts with kind of broad demographics and macroeconomic factors, looks at a demand analysis, and then also supply. That's what the transformation analysis is, all the way down through. And then on the right, I have what that actually looks like in the Vermont Pathways model, which is a model that was built and used to support development of strategies for both the Comprehensive Energy Plan, which was published in January of 2022, and the Climate Action Plan, which came out in December of 2021. And I'll say, I'm happy to touch on specifics as we get into Q&A, but this really is built from the bottom up. I mean, modeling, for example, in the residential sector goes down to specific technologies used in different types of buildings in rural versus urban areas. So it provides both a kind of statewide look at many indicators, but can be sliced and diced in more granular ways to help support development of these plans. And then the way we approached the modeling was really, we ended up running 4 different scenarios to help guide, again, the strategies. And I have the starting points here. We had a 90% renewable by 2050 goal as a starting point that was established in previous comprehensive energy plans in Vermont. And then these greenhouse gas emissions reduction requirements that were established by the Global Warming Solutions Act, with these 3 kind of core target years in 2025, 2030, and 2050. So we looked at the whole range, starting with historical data in 2015 through 2019 at the time, and then modeled out from 2020 to 2050 and looked at a business as usual scenario. So what's our current state? And then 3 different scenarios. One called the central mitigation scenario, which was really focused on kind of the core path, or one core pathway to meet those greenhouse gas reduction requirements. And when we say a scenario, that really involved the compilation of many different mitigation pathways. So different levels of weatherization, electrification measures. And then we ran 2 core scenario, like sensitivities, I guess, off of that core, specifically for the Comprehensive Energy Plan. I think more so than the Climate Action Plan, but one that really emphasized biofuels and one that looked more at local electricity resources. So different levels of large hydro, which is a big part of our power supply here in Vermont, behind the meter solar and load management, versus less electrification and more kind of emphasis. So I will pause there, just not to take up too much time with the front matter, but I'll say this is a tool we've continued to use. It was certainly impactful for developing these 2 models. but is a tool that we've carried through other aspects of energy planning since its development. And actually, our climate action plan is in the process of being developed. And so this tool will get another update for that. So happy to talk more about that as we get into the Q&A and discussion portion, but I would say this was certainly a core component of development of both of those plans that we continue to use. So thanks.
Thanks, Claire. Really appreciate the overview of your model. Sushma, are you ready to get going?
I am. I may need you to pull it up because we have
Sure, no problem.
issues. Apologies for the earlier mishap. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about North Carolina's energy planning work that was done in 2019. North Carolina is ranked right now about 10th in the nation for the amount of electricity generated across all the states. We're a pretty big consumer as well as producer of electricity. Next. So in 2018, about a year after Governor Cooper came into office, he issued an executive order, number 80, that was titled Commitment to Address Climate Change and Transition to a Clean Energy Economy. This was over a decade after the state had addressed climate change issues and energy efficiency and clean energy production under a prior administration. So you can just imagine in 2018, we hadn't looked at this topic for almost a decade. So it was well welcomed activity, and I'll describe what happened then. Next. And so as part of that executive order, he set a requirement, a goal for us to achieve 40% reductions in greenhouse gas emissions by 2025, have our administration and DOT work towards at least 80,000 vehicles by 2025 that are zero emitting vehicles, and then reducing energy consumption in our state buildings by at least 40%. So these were 3 goals that we were working towards. In addition to that, he set aside specific requirements for cabinet agencies to deliver energy planning documents. Next. And our Department of Environmental Quality was tasked to produce a clean energy plan. The requirements were to have a forward-looking plan that addressed both the clean energy resources, energy efficiency, and the use of renewables and innovation in technologies in the public-private sectors. He tasked our department to work with the public and the industries and the businesses to deliver a forward-looking 21st century clean energy plan. He also established a climate council that was comprised of all of our cabinet agencies officials, and that team worked as the implementer and the executive leadership for complying with the executive order. So about 9 months later, our department in the State Energy Office, we worked with 2 leading national partners, Regulatory Systems Project, and later on with RAP to prepare this clean energy plan. This was a robust stakeholder process. This is the first time any Southeast state had looked into comprehensive energy planning and what the state would achieve in the 21st century. Part of this work entailed visioning as a state where we wanted to be, what our values and priorities were, and how do we wanted our system to change from today to achieve these values in the future. I'm not going to go into the details of what it took to produce this plan, but we did a lot of modeling and data analysis to support the 3 primary goals that came out of this plan. And again, the key thing that we heard across the state is that carbon reductions and affordability and reliability were the 3 tenets of the state's priorities. And so we set out this vision of what a clean energy future for the state could look like. We knew that we needed to further develop carbon reduction policies for accelerated retirement of what we call uneconomical coal assets, and base it on market-based competitive options for clean energy future. We knew that we needed to develop and implement policies and alternative tools for regulatory reform. And we identified performance-based regulations, multi-year rate planning, and additional tools in the toolbox to achieve those objectives. We also realized that our grid was not ready for that clean energy future, and that modernization and adaptation to address the already experienced resiliency problems in our grid and our assets needed to be part of that planning. So we spent the next year in 2020 during the COVID year to look at two of the key recommendations coming out of the Clean Energy Plan. One team looked at carbon reduction pathways, while another team looked at regulatory reform. In the first group, we looked at 3 different pathways towards carbon emission reductions. We utilized a capacity expansion model and its analysis over various time periods. One of the pathways we looked at is the retirement of our coal assets under a specific timeline, looking at the carbon markets and carbon adders, and then looking at clean energy standard as another pathway. I won't get into the details of that, but this took almost a year to evaluate what those pathways could look like. Another thing I'll say is this was also a stakeholder process. The utility that we rely on, Duke Energy, often in their IRP planning would produce supporting material and information that was not well understood by the community, the public, and sometimes even the experts. This allowed us to evaluate options that were differing from the utility. And I'll go into a little bit detail of how it's changed the current way energy resource planning is being evaluated by third parties. And in parallel to that, we also the department-led regulatory reform process. And this, as I mentioned earlier, PBR and wholesale market reform. We also looked at securitization of coal assets and competitive procurement. All that is in this document. I won't get into the details, but it's become an enormous resource. Some other states have asked about that. And we believe that it is one of our best work with partnerships with national experts. And amazingly, when we were doing all that stakeholder work, you can imagine in the South, the word carbon and climate is not easy to talk about, even back then in 2019. And we were asked to steer away from even bringing those terminologies into energy resource planning. And we felt like through this process, which created a common dialogue and a comprehensive evaluation of what we valued and how to translate that value into decision support tools, that convinced people from both parties to recognize that we needed a reform. And amazingly, within a few months, a legislation was introduced and it passed bipartisanly across North Carolina's Republican-led Senate and House, and Governor Cooper, as a Democrat, signed this bill. It became law in 2021, almost less than a year after that work that I just mentioned. And it codified it's in statute our carbon reduction target. Our clean energy plan basically said we needed to achieve a 70% reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050. And that became part of that law that I just mentioned, 951. It also codified performance-based regulation in our statute, which was Duke Energy's preference, including multi-year rate plans. But we basically said we can achieve many of our objectives through PBR mechanisms, and we laid out metrics for those performance evaluations. It also codified coal securitization as a means for early retirement. So I just wanted to, just share with this audience that when it seems impossible for addressing climate carbon reductions, when made through the lens of the message that resonates across aisles, you can achieve some of these objectives. I would say, I think that last slide shows where things are. I would say that the tough part now is how to make the best of this legislation. We're not there yet. The devil is in the details. The last 2 years, the Utilities Commission has been involved in reviewing and approving Duke Energy's carbon plan, which is part of the law. And there's been a lot of ups and downs in whether or not this 30% by 2030 could be achieved. So I won't get into the details of that, but the last thing I'll say is the electricity demand model is turned upside down the last year to 2 years. The demand for AI, for cryptocurrency, large data centers, and North Carolina is #1 place to do business, has brought a demand for energy electrification on top of that. And we're seeing an exponential growth in energy demand. And the utilities are going back to their original approach towards planning, and which is fossil fuel based immediate answer. And so it's being challenged quite a bit in carbon planning. And so I believe we have a lot of work to do in actually making things happen. So with that, I'll pause. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Sushma. Great presentation. Let's turn things over to Ryan, and then we'll get into our discussion.
So hi, everybody. My name is Ryan Welsh. I'm with the Virginia Department of Energy as an energy technology analyst, as Sam mentioned. So to really frame, the governor released the Virginia Energy Plan in 2022, and we had a lot of success related with that, and we've received a lot of positive feedback. But to understand that process, we need to go back a little bit before that. And so legislatively, Virginia has a code to create an energy plan for the state of Virginia, directed by the DOE. And this looks at things like resource adequacy, EVs, emissions, and other factors related to energy. And it's really focused on all energy production in the Commonwealth. But within the 2022 energy plan, we specifically focused on the electric sector. And then the next part of this is in 2020, the Virginia legislature passed the Virginia Clean Economy Act, which sets certain emissions goals for the states through the RPS standard for our 2 largest utilities, Dominion and Appalachian Power. And those goals are 2050 for Appalachian Power to be 100% RPS, and 2045 for Dominion. And what this graph is trying to show is that in 2020, and you can see the light blue line in the bottom, Virginia was forecast to have relatively flat load growth. And going into 22, we had seen that there had been a bump in load growth, and we knew that the assumptions that really drove VSEA were no longer fully true. And so maybe things needed to be adapted. We needed to be able, the thought process is that there is no real silver bullet to this problem, as would need silver buckshot, as my former undergraduate mentor, you would say, to these large complex problems that we face. And so the idea was, well, let's see if we, using every tool that we could possibly use in the toolbox, what could be the solution to Virginia. And that's what really drove our the data-driven methodology that we tried to use and implement at the Virginia Department of Energy. And while we didn't use any formal simulation models to drive this plan, we did develop some simple mathematical models, as well as we did a lot of data analysis to look at historical trends and where we were going in the future to determine good recommendations. Some of those recommendations included the deployment of advanced small modular reactors for nuclear. They looked at reevaluating inclusion of certain things that were initially implemented in VSEA. And so that's kind of where things stand in the actual Commonwealth. And I'm interested in the conversation, and so I was trying to keep my opening remarks short. And I guess if there's any follow-up questions to talk about related to the energy planning process that we did in Virginia, those can be discussed there as well.
All right, thanks so much, Ryan. All right, folks, we have gone through all 3 of our opening presentations by our speakers. If you do have questions, please feel free to put them into the Q&A box or the chat box, and we'll read them out once we get going. In the meantime, I do have a few questions here for all of our speakers. So this is kind of an open question for everybody here. So what really was your decision-making process when you selected a modeler, or in North Carolina's case, several modelers to kind of support your plan? And what would you do differently for next time?
Yeah, in the clean energy plan itself, we were offered, we didn't have the resources and the time. So environmental groups, private groups did their own modeling, their energy resource planning using, in one case, IPM, another case, it was their own model. And they presented a variety of scenarios of how we could achieve different carbon targets. So we were very grateful for that, and we got that in time. What was difficult about it is that everyone had a different starting point. Everyone had their own projections of what the future demand would be. And on top of that, everyone had their own assumptions. And none of them matched the utilities IRP. And so we spent quite a bit of time trying to do apples to apples comparison. But it did give us an indication that what was currently on the books was not going to get us to the carbon reductions that the public was demanding. And it did allow us to look at alternatives. And that was how we presented the clean energy plan, that there are different pathways towards further reductions outside of the current practice. When we got into the carbon reduction modeling, which is the targeted work that we did there, Duke University led the work. We supported financially to bring ICF to do IPM modeling. And there, the stakeholders really for over 6 months were engaged in what scenarios we model, what assumptions we follow, and then the results were then compiled and they synthesized their data into a report. At the end of the day, it's really, I would say, the lessons learned is it still didn't meet the type of granularity that the Utilities Commission and the public staff, the consumer advocates needed for regulatory planning. I think Duke, with the immense resources that they have, and utilities have this to do production cost modeling, gave them an advantage to be able to say reliability and affordability are only captured through their analysis. And so in conclusion, I'll say what we walked away with is recognizing that our regulatory process, the people who actually do the modeling at the Utilities Commission and the public staff needed those similar tools to do it on their own. So it's not just dependent on what the utility provides. And so we came out with a resource that Encompass, I believe, is still being used. And now the public staff are actively trained and using that model to test the utilities assumptions and their forecasts. And they're able to respond in the official dockets what their analysis shows. And I think we're at a better place as a result of all of this work.
That I think aligns pretty well. I'll say that I think there are different factors that influenced our choice, but the usability of the model and the ability for it to be kind of transparent were definitely key factors as well. There was definitely interest in having a tool that could be shared. Like we were able to post at the end a version of the model that could be downloaded and inspected. We had definitely had conversations through other stakeholder processes, but having a tool that could be a transparent place to talk about data and assumptions, I think was key. And then the ability to have staff eventually trained to use the tool to then continue the work moving forward, I think was also key for us here in Vermont.
And for us, for the Virginia, I'll just say, just adding to our knowledge base, helping furthering our understanding of resource adequacy planning and grid planning at large for T&D systems. We're always working to better educate ourselves on this complex problem. but having more knowledge when we wrote the 22 energy plan would have been informative.
Great. And I want to, Sushma, I want to dig back into that, to what you said a little bit earlier, where you mentioned that, you know, the assumptions that the environmental organizations had for their models differed from what Duke Energy had for its own utility assumptions. How did you kind of reconcile the differences there in order to get to sort of a consensus result, if possible, or did you have to find a way around to kind of work with those differences?
I would say we tried. I don't think we achieved consensus at all. One example that, remember, you're really making me think back 4 years now. One example is the assumption behind natural gas price forecast. There was a lot of debate over what it should be. And at the end of the day, I think the public staff, which was ultimately the people that touch this and get a sense of what's reasonable, you know, provided pretty good feedback that got integrated into the model. Another area that was never really resolved was the capacity factors. The utility had a different approach towards renewable resource capacity factors, particularly wind energy and solar energy. And we try to use NREL's, you know, guidance and how they approach in their modeling and recommendations. So that was one. The levelized costs were also contentious. And then I would say at that time, battery resources and utility batteries for utility planning and storage was also new. And we could not come to a good understanding of how much of a discharge is reasonable. I recall the utility wanting to get only down to 80% of that discharge. And then, so what would end up happening is the cost for the remaining 20% could make or break a potential pathway because the costs were still fairly high. So I hope that was helpful.
No, I think it was very helpful. I guess to follow up, you know, when you got your modeling results, and I think we kind of touched on this a little earlier, but I want to also dig into this a little bit further. You know, what did you find? What did you find when you got your modeling results? Did those results influence you to choose different policy or programmatic routes than maybe the ones you had initially kind of envisioned at the start of the modeling process? Or how did that kind of impact your plan's development?
Yeah, I think there was in that Duke Energy study, there was a lot of discussion and debate, as I recall, between a carbon trading program and a carbon standard, right? And being a southern state, we're not part of the carbon trading program as it is, as Mid-Atlantic and Northeastern states are. And there was quite a bit of discussion as to whether that should be the primary policy pathway versus a carbon standard. And I think that if I remember right, that document showed that we couldn't get to our 70% goal without having both. And the legislation a couple months later set a carbon target, which you could assume that is like more of a carbon standard. So I think we succeeded in getting the information out and the knowledge out. About a year later, our legislature basically put a moratorium or just a stop to any kind of carbon trading program. So regulatorily, we can't approach that in our rulemaking. But the carbon standard or the carbon target itself is in law. So I think we got to where we are at, but I want to just say that we're not there yet because the utility still had a lot of flexibility. They could use costs and reliability as a way to backtrack and or achieve their objectives. That I think there are a lot of people that are not happy that is the way it's going.
Thanks. Clara, Ryan, any thoughts on that? For how data and modeling kind of maybe influenced you on your policy choices in the end, or what you put in the plan?
I think it certainly helped like focus parts of the conversation, like in Vermont, for example, around like the emissions in a cross sector. We already have had 75% by renewable portfolio by 2032. That was recently increased to 100% by our legislature this past session. But I think having that and having the data on the utilities existing power supply contracts, some of which are already exceeding their requirements, really focused the conversation on the thermal and transportation sectors and thinking about strategies to achieve those emissions reductions requirements, which are in some cases much more ambitious and challenging. And I'd say, I think the way LEAP works is you put in kind of like a number, like I need X number of weatherizations, and then the conversation is how do we get to that in a policy or regulatory way? And I think through those outputs, there was some refinement of like what is actually achievable, like reasonable to be putting into the model, regardless of what we may think we need. But I definitely think that there's some also pushback, between what a priority is versus what the modeling says. And I don't always know that the data and modeling changed some of those conversations, but it, again, depended on the sector. So
I'd say that we had a pretty strong notion of what our recommendations were going to be beforehand. And I think that our data analysis exercise really helped us to visually show and emphasize the concepts we'd been hearing and learning and studying about. And so that it was just much more effective to get those recommendations across. And a lot of those recommendations have been worked with and dealt with. We've since restored a lot of discretion and authority to our Public Utility Commission as a result of suggestions that were put in the 2022 energy plan. And so I think it was just all around a good exercise to really show here's what's actually going on for the Commonwealth's power.
Got it. And Ryan, kind of a follow-up to your question. Obviously, Virginia's been going through a huge spurt in the growth of data centers, just similar to North Carolina, but especially in Northern Virginia and in a couple locations. Since you put out the plan, have you found that generally kind of how has the data changed, and how has that kind of maybe changed your thinking even since the plan has come out? How have you had to adjust, given the changes that have been going on the ground?
So, and I'm glad you brought that up. So Virginia, as Sushma noted about North Carolina, has a large data center presence already. We have Data Center Alley, Data Center Capital of the World, and the DOM zone specifically in Virginia is expected to grow at 5.6% annually year over year, leading to roughly doubling in peak energy needs by 2038. And so with all of that in mind, I can't pull my presentation back up, but in 22, we saw some growth over the original 2020 forecast. And in 2024, we just see that demand skyrocketing. And so we've been working to better show, thanks, Sam. So the dark blue line over the light blue line would be the difference between when the SEIA, the Virginia Clean Economy Act, was implemented, and then the green line would be the 2022 energy plan. And so we've been really working to both qualitate and quantify the trends that we're seeing, both on energy demand growth, as well as the trends that we're seeing within the PJM RTO in regards to retirements of dispatchable generation, queue delays, and all of these other things that are going on. Because at the end of the day, and I kind of was going to get to this in a later part, we are part of this vast energy and power sector system. And so the decisions we're making, the decisions other states are making, are affecting each other. And so that's really what we need to do as we work to understand these problems, is figure out how we're not operating in a vacuum so that we can have effective policy.
Following on that, you mentioned, you're not in a vacuum, and this is true, I guess, for every state. I think every state has portions of it that are going to be in an RT, or at least in an RTO for you three states. You probably used in-state data sources, but you probably also, need to think about maybe some more regional, data as well, since you said, you're not operating in a vacuum. So what data sets, for your states do you find to be especially useful when you constructed your plans?
So EIA is a great data source. And so that's probably where the bulk of our data came from, as well as we worked with the utilities to acquire some data. And then we had a large, we had many conversations with PJM. And so that is kind of, we did get data from all of these sources. We're looking at what other states in the RTO is doing, what the RTO itself is doing, as well as what MISO and YISO are doing, because they are the biggest trading partners with PJM. And so that's really where a lot of our data came from, is all of those sources.
Say in Vermont, we're fortunate to have a number of locally sourced forecasts that we were able to build into the model. For example, we included all our power utilities, power supply forecasts, existing contracts as like a baseline. We also have statewide energy efficiency potential. We do a potential study in Vermont every 3 years. And then our transmission utility, Valco, does a 20-year transmission plan every, I believe it's 3 years as well. So it does a load forecast that includes like adoption around heat pumps and electric vehicles. So those were all really core inputs for us, in addition to some fuel data from the tax. But I feel like there are also definitely many data challenges that we face, and maybe we'll get into that later. But yeah, we were fortunate to have a good number of local sources, and then similar to Ryan, rely on national models or forecasts to fill the gaps.
I guess, Chris, do you have any questions for our speakers?
Sure, I'd love to jump into 1 or 2 questions. Thank you very much. This is fascinating conversation. A couple of you have mentioned working with the utilities and your state commissions around the regulatory uses for the modeling. I'm curious how you use models and the outputs like this to engage the community. Are you working with environmental groups, or are they receptive to this kind of modeling? And are you able to use that to build relationships with other energy stakeholders that might be outside of the formal state or utility systems?
Well, fortunately, we were coordinating with the work ongoing in the Climate Council. So I think a lot of those stakeholders were involved in some at a high level, perhaps not at the community level, but so we're helpful to bring them in to sort of vet some of the initial assumptions. And then I will say one partner that has been really helpful to work with this data around has been in Vermont. We have 11 regional planning commissions that do more local planning, and then they work with all of the municipalities in Vermont to develop enhanced energy plans. It's a voluntary basis, but we, after the statewide plans were done, work to break down all of the statewide outputs around emissions, also electrification, demand for different fuels to those 11 regions so that they could incorporate them in their regional plans as a way to help ensure there was consistency between kind of all these planning. So it's been specifically, I think, helpful to engage them in those conversations. And I think they're also becoming more active in some of the, utility and Climate Council related work. So hoping that that can help bring some of that local knowledge that they have up into those conversations and inform our modeling as we move forward as well.
I could go next on that question, Chris. So in North Carolina, what I'm seeing is, in addition to the IOUs filing, which is accompanied by the appropriate modeling, we're seeing 2 sets of data and modeling that is being filed as interveners. The Consumer Advocate Group, which is part of our Utilities Commission, an independent arm for the consumer protection. As I mentioned, they've been now for the first time have been using models and tools to be able to give their feedback on in the docket. So they're presenting their own modeling and their own questions and recommendations to the commission. We're also seeing a second group of modeling and other interveners, and that's from the third party. We're seeing our Attorney General's office hire modelers, and they do their filing and say, this is the way it's supposed to be. But the other group is local governments and towns and municipalities with climate targets. They're bringing on their own resources, modelers to challenge or agree with the IOU's filing. And so they're becoming more active interveners. Thus far, I don't think they have been able to achieve their recommended pathways. The commission has more sided with the utilities' explanations and reasons for going towards those IRPs.
Part of the Virginia Energy Planning process was the engagement of over 200 diverse stakeholders, getting feedback from them. And we did receive a lot of positive feedback on the energy plan from businesses as well as from all of our electricity providers, be it utilities, cooperatives, or competitive service providers.
Thank you all. And maybe a kind of similar question to we discussed earlier on electricity load growth. You know, as Ryan's presentation pointed out, the forecasting changed pretty quickly, a little bit abruptly with sustained projected load growth. You know, the modeling that we've been talking about today is largely focused on these big comprehensive state energy plans. With just the speed that we're seeing the paradigm shift in electricity, are you able to use the similar modeling efforts to inform, you know, maybe legislative requests, day-to-day parts of your jobs? How are you seeing modeling as something that bolsters your regular job outside of the comprehensive energy planning?
So I'll go and give you a broader perspective. So as the environmental department for the state of North Carolina, the energy planning work that we did was what we call more of a I wouldn't call it advocacy, but more of forward-looking. You know, no one else was doing it, and we met the governor's charge to make people think differently and start having a conversation in the state. But as a regulatory agency, we're now addressing EPA's 4 primary power plant rules, right? The 111D, which is the requirements for carbon pollution standards for existing power plants, and 111B for new power plants. And alongside of that, they also released the coal ash rules, effluent guidelines for discharge of waters in the Clean Water Act, and one more of MATS rules, which is air toxics from stacks of coal power plants. All of these federal regulations are now merging into what is the utility going to do now. And in our state, we still have 7 coal-fired power plants with different retirement schedules, depending on when they can get replacement generation in by natural gas and maybe hopefully wind energy. And so the conversation is now, as the utility planning goes with the Utilities Commission, where does the environmental regulatory planning go, and which of the timeline ends up becoming the decision point. So it's quite possible that they may accelerate some retirements or potentially postpone some retirements, depending on where their best financial and or load, you know, growth, reliability, all that mixes. It's to be determined, you know, if any of these regulatory acts, regulations end up becoming challenged, then it may be back to where we are today. But I think a lot has changed in both regulatory planning as well as resource planning.
I'm just going to say that we are constantly using it to guide the conversation for the ever-evolving landscape we are operating in via different federal regulations, different assumptions, and forecasted load growth, and so that we can figure out how does Virginia successfully capture all this economic development while maintaining and building an energy system that is reliable, affordable, and increasingly clean.
Yeah, and I'll just say we rely heavily on modeling and data where we can to inform our advocacy. In some ways, I mentioned continue to use the specific model that informed the comprehensive energy plan. For example, there was a more detailed focus on thermal sector mitigation measures that we collaborated again with the Agency of Natural Resources on to develop a better understanding of kind of the suite of policy options to address the thermal sector. And then I think there are other ways where like a big statewide cross-sector model doesn't help you get as deep into the weeds as you might need to be. So for example, we just did a deep dive on our renewable energy standard in particular and related programs, and we actually ended up developing with some contractual support from Sustainable Energy Advantage, a separate model where we able to look a little more deeply specific to that policy and to assess the costs and benefits. And so we definitely rely on modeling, and just the question is, I think, how broad or deep you need to get for us in terms of what we use.
Sure, thank you all. Sam, throw it back to you.
Great, thanks. So we have about 6 minutes left here, so I want to just kind of go to a couple quick wrap-up questions before we call it a day. So obviously we've talked a lot about the process for modeling. I think from your perspectives, what are maybe the key like 1 to 2 steps, that the first steps that an energy office or a governor's office should really be taking in order to incorporate modeling into the next iteration of their comprehensive energy plan?
I'll say I think one big question we grappled with at the very start was what the scale of the modeling would be, whether it would be a statewide model, which is what we ended up doing, versus a more granular model that, for example, represented the Vermont Regional Planning Commissions, knowing that we work with them quite closely, which was pretty structural to the way the model was designed and possibly the questions we were able to answer with it. So I feel like that scale question, what will be most useful to the questions you're trying to answer? And also, which was the turning point for us, the data that was available to support that was a big question for us right from the start. And we ultimately found we didn't have the granularity of more local data to support that type of modeling, which is why we went with the larger statewide model. But yeah, that scale question, I think, was a big one for us right off the top, and then associated with what data is available to inform the effort that you're working on.
I would say for those states that are looking at this, first ask, how do you define comprehensive energy planning? Not all states look at generation. Sometimes most of their electricity is imported. But for us, including generation as part of that comprehensive planning is number one. Another question is, to what extent transmission and distribution planning is incorporated into that generation resource planning? And often, and this is still true with us in North Carolina, they're almost separated, but somehow integrated. And a couple of years ago, we worked with NASIO and NARUC to look at comprehensive energy planning where you can't isolate generation from transmission because they're so linked, especially with renewables, and now even with natural gas and battery storage assets. So, I would recommend that you can't, before you could look at just resource planning in terms of generation. It has to be looked at holistically, particularly if your state is looking at grid resiliency and grid reliability issues from storms and climate effects. Investments in those distribution and transmission resources could really affect how you do generation planning.
And I agree with both points made. Defining scale is really important, as well as the inclusion of the other 2/3 of the electricity system that most people like to ignore because it's not near as fun to look at and study. And then for us, one of the first important steps is really defining what is our base case for which we're going to define everything towards, and having a good foundational base case as well as a foundational non-intervention case, as if the system was to choose the least cost optimized resource plan, what does that actually look like? And then we can talk about cost deltas from there.
Great. And then our final question is, what's your top takeaway out of everything we've talked about? What is maybe the one thing you want to make sure that, the energy officials and governors advisors on the call leave here with?
Well, I don't actually know if I said this, but others have talked about the stakeholder process. And I feel like for us, that has been a big, not even just a takeaway, but a learning curve of how you effectively incorporate a stakeholder process with meaningful engagement into the modeling. From how do you start with public engagement and use that to inform the scope of your model, from how do you effectively communicate the scenarios you're modeling and the outputs to, not just the in the weeds folks who know what you're talking about when you talk about through all the acronyms, but the community members, and translating it into a language that, or I guess, language words that really resonate with where they're coming from, and the time that it takes to do that too. So that's a big takeaway for us, and definitely something we're working on.
I would say from my perspective, the takeaway is more in the mid-2000s, I think most states could see their electricity consumption and their state domestic product decouple, right? where for the first time in our history in the last 100 years, where we were no longer coupling energy production with growth. Economic growth was decoupled from electricity production. And then moving forward in the next decade, I see that being recoupled unless we're smart. And we will go back to energy dependency as a clear driver in economic growth. And everything we talked about today is that growth is here, and the demand curves and all these things that we forecasted are probably going to be thrown out the window in the next few years. And how do we create policies around prevention of that dependency is going to be a transformational measure as a nation and as a state. So I pay attention to that.
And I'm going to speak along the same lines as if we're making models to look at things, be willing to change the assumptions in the models and be willing to listen to what the model has to say as the assumptions that are happening in the real world are changing. And then back to the other point of like specifically related to Virginia's load growth, I think that's a clear example of we were at 1% and we've gone to 5% annually. And that the energy policy for those scenarios are two completely different things. And then the other point I'll just make is the recognition that many states are in RTOs, and energy policy that you or other states making are having an effect in that RTO.
All right. So we are at time here. So wanted to first just give a big thank you to all of our speakers here. This is a great conversation, really, really enlightening here. And also a big thank you to our co-host, Chris Fletcher here with NGA. Please tune in next time. Our next topic on this webinar training series is going to be focused around stakeholder engagement. So to build off what Claire said, how that stakeholder engagement process is critical to really kind of making sure you've got the right assumptions in your modeling. We'll be discussing that with 3 new state representatives next month. So please be sure to tune back in a month. In the meantime, please, stay cool and enjoy, the upcoming holidays, and we will talk to you at the end of July. Thank you so much and have a great rest of the week.